And we're going to turn our attention to football. We're going to talk to Daniel Harris, who's standing by. Daniel, good morning to you.
Hiya.
Thanks a million for jumping on. We've an FA Cup final to chat about, and we'll do that in a minute. But first of all, if you don't mind, could we start with your piece that you've written in The Guardian yesterday evening? It appeared online about anti-Semitism in football, specifically about inaction, I think, around anti-Semitism in football. It's a very personal story. It's extremely well written and hopefully challenging, I guess, for lots of football goers.
Yeah, I think that what happened was a few weeks ago, I wrote a story. I came by some anti-Semitism in the WhatsApp group of the Ashburton Army, and who are an Arsenal fan group who have been involved with the club a little bit. The club are helping them in a bid to improve the atmosphere. And as a Jew, and I say this in the piece, you're never really surprised when you come across anti-Semitism. So to explain that, my grandmother survived the Holocaust, so did my grandfather. And when that happens, I think Jews of my parents' generation were raised to see anti-Semitism everywhere, as you might imagine, because of what had happened to their parents and what they grew up with. So as a Jew, you're never really surprised when you come across anti-Semitism, because it is in a lot of places, and you've kind of been raised to be on the lookout for it. Like, there'd always be kind of, in Jewish homes, you'd know which celebrities were thought to be anti-Semitic, for example. And I'm sure that all different minorities have their versions of this too. But so I wasn't surprised when I came by these messages when they were sent to me. But what I was surprised by were how many of them there were, the real ferocity of them. Like, some of the stuff was so specific that it really, it burned your eyes. And I said to the editor that I was dealing with at the time, I've heard about these messages. I haven't got them yet. Someone's sending them to me. And I know that he thought what I thought. He thought, yeah, whatever, there'll be some borderline stuff. And what actually happened was there was loads of stuff. And and it wasn't just how much of it there was, as I said, but the ferocity of it, and also the apparent lack of interventions by almost everyone on that group. And so that was why I wrote about it. And then that was why I wanted to write about anti-Semitism more generally, because, as I also say in the piece, it is much easier being Jewish in the UK today than it is being a lot of other things. And I understand that. I understand that very well as someone who's married to a British Ghanaian. In fact, yeah, I thought it was something I thought I understood before, but I absolutely did not understand it until I started seeing my wife a long time ago now. So I think that's a really important point to make, but nevertheless, it doesn't change the fact that if you support Arsenal in particular, but not just Arsenal, something you have to factor into your football support is the presence of anti-Semitism because of the Tottenham connection. I know this also happens; it also affects other London clubs, and it's also important to say that Arsenal, I know, are doing great work to try and combat this. But the idea that this stuff exists in society, which it does, and doesn't exist in football, is obviously nonsense. But we could then say, well, it's a social problem, so what's football got to do with it? But what I want to say is football is its incredible social force. In some ways, there's nothing in the world that is like football. Genuinely, there is nothing that crosses boundaries of social boundaries, religious boundaries, borders of sexuality, borders of sex. Any kind of border you can put up, football has crossed that. And I don't think you can say that about anything, because the other, I guess, two massive pan-global things are religion, and obviously we know there are a few different ones of those, and music is quite regional. So football is that thing, and if football is that thing, then we should be using football to make the world a better place. And not just for Jews either, but for all the different minorities who have felt othered in some way by the football machine.
It's that point is worthy of a thesis that I'm sure has been done. It's worthy of an hour-long conversation. The point about the blank canvas nature of sport, and we are guaranteed are going to get comments here saying, sports show, stick to the sport, but I am absolutely on board with that idea of it being a blank canvas for the exposure of the brilliant things and the fallibilities of society, and the opportunity to use sport as a mechanism to tackle some of those things. Can you talk to us a little bit about, you mentioned about Arsenal, but about the role of Tottenham in it as well? Daniel, because you bring up a really interesting point in the article about the issue around non-Jewish Tottenham fans referring to themselves as the Y word, and the, I guess, cyclical nature in some regards of that being then used against them as non-Jewish people as a term of abuse. And it's a really complex circle, and I wonder about that, and I wonder about the role that Tottenham have to play in that in terms of an appetite to stamp it out.
Yeah, just to go back to one thing you said before that, you said that people say just stick to the football. So I think it's important to say that deciding not to talk about politics is a political decision. So it is not possible to keep politics out of football. Every time you have three people in a situation, there is politics. And when you have, say, the World Cup, you have nation states singing anthems, wearing colours of their flags, competing at stuff. That is political, like nations are involved. So I just wanted to make that point. So opting not to talk about politics when you're talking about sport is itself a political decision. But on specifically to do with Tottenham, I'm someone, as people who listen to the show know, like, I go to football. So I understand how football crowds work and how football identity works. And so what you've got is you've had a situation where Spurs have been decided by other people that they're a Jewish club. For what it's worth, when I was a kid growing up in North London in the 80s and 90s, I went to the biggest Jewish primary school, went to the biggest Jewish secondary school. Tottenham were the best supported club. I mean, I guess I think that might well have changed now in North London. I think it's probably Arsenal seems to be more widely supported, but Spurs were categorised as this Jewish club. At the time, they were owned by Irving Scholar, who was Jewish. They were owned by Alan Sugar, who was Jewish. So that sort of that prompted some rival supporters, I'd say particularly the other London clubs, but not just other London clubs. I've had words with people about this at United as well, but I'd say mainly London clubs, to say, well, Spurs are a Jewish club, and then give Spurs anti-Semitic abuse as though all of them were Jewish. And whether that's meant... whether Spurs are an avatar for Jews or it's just an opportunity to say the stuff that you're not really meant to say, who knows? But Spurs are, as you say, termed as Yids and then what's happened is Spurs have taken that word and called it and applied it to themselves. In, I guess, the phrase that would generally be used is they're reclaiming the word, except that word isn't theirs to reclaim. For what it's worth, it's not been a massive term of anti-Semitic abuse in my experience. The stuff people are likely to say, the anti-Semitic abuse I've had in my life, tends not to reference that word, but in a footballing context, that is the word. And it was very prominent in that Ashburton Army WhatsApp group that I referred to before. And what you end up with, because we know, as you mentioned, the cyclical nature of football chanting. Team A chants one thing, Team B chants something worse if they can think of it, and we go round and round. So what you get is you now get Spurs, non-Jewish Spurs fans, calling themselves Yids, almost to bait anti-Semitic abuse out of other clubs. I see it watching United as well, where people will sing "Where's Your Famous Munich Song" in order to sort of bait Munich abuse out of other people. Because the Munich abuse came first, but then it becomes one group's ability to act, whether it's disaster chanting or anti-Semitic chanting or racist chanting, becomes something that their rivals use against them to incite them to do it again. So what you end up with is non-Jewish Tottenham fans singing "We Are the Yids" or "Yid Army" or whatever in order to incite anti-Semitic abuse out of other non-Jewish fans. And at the same time, Jews are expected to believe that no Tottenham fan who's chanting those words is secretly thinking, this is kind of cute, isn't it? I can go to the game and I can chant this. I can't do it anywhere else. And that is one of the great things about football. I appreciate that. And I say this in the piece, that you are able to feel feelings that you can't feel anywhere else. You're able to sing songs that you can't sing anywhere else. And it's that off-key humour that you also find in the changing room or dormitories or classrooms or whatever. But we're expected to believe that no Tottenham fan is enjoying the chanting of Yid Army because it involves Yid Army or whatever. And that itself also feels like, I can't stretch my credulity that far. Supporters
groups have a lot to play in this, Daniel, don't they? You mentioned the Ashburton Army there. For people unfamiliar, they're an Arsenal supporters group, but people unfamiliar with how these chants sometimes are arranged, a lot of these supporters groups just meet up in a pub, come up with chants, decide what's good, decide what's not. Maybe tell us what, like the Ashburton Army, a lot of their chants have been problematic, let's just say, in recent years.
I don't know. I don't think it's an Ashburton Army thing. I don't really want to focus on them because it's this wide problem. I haven't. I could easily have written the piece and said, well, I want these people to be found and punished. But it's not about vengefulness, and it's not about specific people. It's about these things are happening now. What global steps can we do to make it better across the board? It's not about singling out the Ashburton Army, who, as far as I understand it, also, in order to join the Ashburton Army, you have to be involved in social action. So they're also people are doing good things, and Arsenal are doing good things. And I don't know how. I mean, I know how football chants sometimes work. Sometimes people sit there and write them, or sometimes something happens at the game and it's just a response to what's happened immediately. So there are all sorts of different ways in which this stuff works. But I think the point is more, we have this problem. It's a problem in society and it's a problem in football. What do we do to try and stop it being a problem in football, while at the same time hoping that by stopping it being a problem in football, then it will also filter through to society, while also society has these other things to do. So rather than becoming the vicious circle that we talked about before, it becomes a virtuous circle.
Yeah, I think your article has done some service, let's say, and I'm sure that I hope it's the start of a conversation as well in a wider scale. Let's talk a little bit about the FA Cup final. I read it yesterday. It was the first time Manchester derby for an FA Cup final, and I had to think to myself, that can't be right. This source is not credible. But it turns out it is. Earlier than usual kickoff, Daniel. Is that 3 o'clock kickoff to do with like 30,000 fans from each club at a neutral venue, and if it spills in a bit later, it might spill over a bit later?
I guess that is probably a security decision, a police decision, in the way that, I remember in the 90s, United used to play, every time United played Leeds, kicked off about 7:30 in the morning. And I guess, it's back to that, the traditional time. It will, let's be real, it will probably be edgy because it's a Manchester United Manchester City Cup final. There's a lot on the line, and people will be feeling edgy about this. I mean, so you will expect there to be people discussing these things with rival supporters. Yeah,
on the face of it, obviously, it's City's inevitable drive to the treble, and it can't be stopped. And then you sort of start to pick away at that, and you look at the two managers, for example, whose careers have interlocked, and you look at the recent games. I mean, and it's hard. I don't know what you're reading into the 6-3 in, was it October, and then the more recent United win in the league. Is there a thread from that game, from one game to the next game to tomorrow, or is this just a total outlier given the nature of the game?
I'd say the 6-3 is partly an outlier because United had only just started under Ten Hag, and Casemiro, they didn't have Casemiro for that game. Varane got injured in the first half. That would be one way of looking at that game, to just totally dismiss it for that reason. But, I mean, that was by far the best any team's played against United this season. And until City sort of started going on this run over the last couple of months, I thought like that was by far the best Premier League performance of the season. And United, I said they didn't have Casemiro in that game, they didn't. But they also did have Lisandro Martinez, and he did find it difficult against Haaland, but it's also the case that I think it was 4-0 at half-time that game. Without Martinez, it would have been more than 4-0. So it would be silly not to notice how well City played that day, and to know that they are capable of playing that well again. On the other hand, as you say, by the time United beat them at Old Trafford, United were a much better team. They had Casemiro, Garnacho was integrated, someone that they could bring on to change things. I think I'd have more of a sneak for United if Martinez was fit. I think not having him makes a massive difference, not just defensively, because they have actually been okay defensively recently. Although I must say, I'm generally not that worried about Victor Lindelof. I think at his best, and not next to Maguire, he's a good player. He's not a player as good as United should have, but he's a good player. But because he lacks both pace and strength, it makes him a problem against Erling Haaland, I think. So I obviously City are big favourites, but United have players that can hurt any team, but they will need to play really well to win, and City probably don't need to play that well to win.
Would you expect United to copy what happened in that 2-1 win at Old Trafford that Adrian mentioned, Daniel? Because they kind of, I guess, corrected some errors that they'd made in the previous game. They stopped defending deep, or they actually focused, defending on deep, attacked quickly, and didn't really press City too high up the pitch as well. So maybe that's one way in which you can beat City. There aren't many ways to beat them, but surely that game is one example Ten Hag can use.
I think the thing about that game that surprised me at the time was because United lost to City at in that 6-3, and it felt like Ten Hag just went into that game and thought, well, we'll play our way and impose our way of playing, and that will be all right. And that obviously didn't work. United were nowhere near good enough to do that. Then I thought that when United played City at home, he wouldn't play Fred. He wouldn't play Christian Eriksen, because in order to compete with City, you need to compete physically and you need to be able to run. And a midfield of Bruno, Christian Eriksen and Casemiro, I think, doesn't have enough legs to take on City. So I think one of the questions Ten Hag has to answer is what the composition of his midfield is. And he might decide to play Christian Eriksen again. I think that would be a mistake. Wembley's a big pitch, and I'd say that they need more legs in midfield. He might then decide to play Christian Eriksen and Fred, and then play Bruno in one of the wide positions, which itself might depend on whether Antony's fit. I'm pretty sure I heard him say, Ten Hag say on Sunday he thought he would be, and he always plays if he is. So you might decide to pack them to just defend the box, which United tried to do when they lost to Guardiola's Barcelona in the 2011 Champions League final. They might decide to defend the box and just hit on the break, in which case you probably want some fast players up front, which, you might then play Garnacho, not Sancho, which I don't think will happen. Or you might think, well, you can't just sit there and wait to concede. You need to try and get in amongst City and try and win the ball high up the pitch, which, again, is something that Fred needs, that you want Fred for. But I think the thing about City that's interesting to me that seems to have changed is that if you think about all of Guardiola's previous teams, they've all been possession teams. And what's happened over the course of the season, more by accident than by design, it kind of feels, is that City have changed from becoming a possession team to a possession team and a power team. Because obviously they signed Haaland, who wasn't particularly a player I think Guardiola wanted that kind of centre-forward. It was just that a centre-forward that good became available, and he was that kind of centre-forward, you have to sign him. But then he's ended up with 3 good defenders at the back, and he's never really had good defenders in defence before, which sounds ludicrous to say. I just found it funny after they beat Chelsea when they got the trophy. He said that sort of the development this year has been defenders you can defend, and maybe not the foremost tactical mind of his generation and many generations, suddenly realising that was a significant thing in a football team. But it is significant when you don't have Busquets, Iniesta and Xavi and Messi to get your defence out of trouble, or to mean that you can't get at that defence. But so he's got 3 blokes at the back who are big and strong and fast: Diaz, Akanji and Walker. And then now in front of them, he's got Rodri and Stones, who are 2 more big lads. And the thing that I felt watching City was the way that they play engaged me in a more visceral manner than against Madrid. They engaged me in a more visceral manner than any Guardiola team has before, because I'm used to watching power teams, really. The Fergie's best teams were mainly power teams. Klopp's teams are power teams as well. And personally, that's what I want in a football team. I want them to be strong and fast and hard and vicious. And watching them against Madrid, which was an incredible performance, they didn't just pass around Madrid, they ran over them. They didn't just run around them, they ran over them. And that is something that we haven't really seen from a Guardiola team before, and something that United will have to contend with, because they're not a particularly big team.
In a word, United or City?
Come on.
City, obviously.
I know City. I know City are favourites. I know City are likely to win. And when I said to my wife, I'm afraid it might be our anniversary, but I'm afraid I've got to nip off to Wembley for a few hours. I know on that day, I know what I'm likely to see. But I'm not going to sit here and say on the day before the cup final and say, yeah, City. I'm afraid I don't have that in my DNA.
And in about the same number of words, are United getting Mason Mount and Harry Kane?
It looks like there's a good chance they'll get Mason Mount. I think he's a good player. If he's being signed for the squad, and they're also in sort of a faster, younger Eriksen, then fair enough. If he was being signed with no other midfield player, then I guess I would have 2 questions. I think United really needs someone who's a bit more physical than Mount, someone who can take the ball off the defence and bring it forward. And that's really what Ten Hag wants. His ideal signing is still Frenkie de Jong. Problem being, he's a bit of a unicorn. If you can't get him, who do you get who's like him? No one really. So I think that, and also, is Mason Mount good enough? As in, I know he's a good player, but in order to compete with City, and that is the benchmark currently, you probably need to be able to engage them in a battle, and you need stronger players than them, or better players than them, or both. And I'm not sure Mount is either of those things, even though I think he's good. But he's someone that United want. He's someone that apparently Arteta likes, that Klopp likes. These guys know ball. They know ball better than me, better than all of us listening to this show. So I have to respect that. And at 24, he's got a lot of improving to do. I like his big game temperament. I like his competitive personality. I like his dedication. So I think that he'd be a good buy, but I'd want someone who would start the big games ahead of him, who was stronger and faster and better. Harry Kane, I'm sure United will try and get Harry Kane. I'm sure they want to try and find out what the lie of the land is with Harry Kane early doors. They don't want to get involved in a row a wrangle with Daniel Levy that lasts the entirety of the summer. It will probably need Harry Kane to burn some bridges. Whether he's prepared to do that or not, I don't know. But I think that he will want to stay in England because he wants Shearer's record to mitigate any lack of trophies that he might end his career without. Do you end your career with a lack of trophies? Without that? I don't know. But whichever it is. So I think that he'd probably be their first choice of striker because he's someone can come in and be brilliant from the off and change it. But whether that is possible or not, who knows?
We shall see. Daniel, thanks a million.
No worries. Have a good weekend. Cheers for having me, lads.
Thanks a lot.